and get started. Fiscal policy by definition, the use of government revenue, money coming in, and expenditure, money going out to influence the economy and how it affects GDP, employment, price level, and economic growth. These are basically government financial decisions on how to use government spending and government revenue to essentially manipulate or influence the economy. This is a pretty important tool for the government to be able to use, especially in times when the economy is dipping or when it's also heating up too fast. You don't want an economy to overheat, and you also don't want a recession. And fiscal policy just allows governments to be able to manipulate a little bit. It's not ideal, it's not great, but it is necessary in some cases. Now, they have a few different options. You can see taxation is an option. The government can increase taxes or decrease taxes. That is totally at the will of the government, and they use those tools as fiscal policy. Government purchases. The government can increase or decrease their purchases simply to spend more money or less money, not because they actually need to buy anything, but because they're either trying to inject money into the economy or take money out of an overheating economy. So these are government purchases simply for the purpose of spending money or not spending money, not because they need something or don't need something. Transfer payments, so this can be the addition of transfer payments or the adjustments to transfer payments. Now, we talked about transfer payments many chapters ago when we talked about unemployment. Transfer payments are those payments from the government. So these are cash payments. So these are going to be things like Social Security checks, disability checks. Right now, it's unemployment checks. I mean, they have changed the way that you file for unemployment. Your eligibility for unemployment has changed in these current times because of changes in this fiscal policy for these very different, unique times. And borrowing. Don't forget that if the government is going to spend more money and they're actually getting less tax revenue from you and I because we're not making as much or we're losing jobs, they have to borrow that money. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end when we watch those videos. But that $2 trillion Trump is talking about and the almost $1 trillion that Obama spent when it was his turn to implement this fiscal policy, that is borrowed money. We have borrowed it, we still owe it back, it just adds to the national debt. So it's complicated. Fiscal policy tools. There's two basic fiscal policy tools. The first is something we call automatic stabilizers. I should have added something additional, sorry, onto this slide. I'll try and go back and do it. But under where it says federal income tax, I would also put those transfer payments. Automatic stabilizers are essentially built-in mechanisms that the government just builds in that just exist from the day to day. They're not exceptional. They're not a big announcement on TV. They are things that are built into our current economic systems to try and level out fluctuations in an economy that we might see. A big one is federal income tax. Now, people who make more money pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. People who make less money pay a lower percentage of their income in taxes. That's an adjustment that stays in our economy all the time. So when people are losing jobs, when people are making less money, federal income tax is lower to keep spending in the economy high. On the flip side of that, in great economic times when people are making a lot of money, they find themselves in higher tax brackets, which then means they're paying a higher percentage of their income in taxes. That's a good thing. We don't want people overheating the economy. So that sort of reduces spending. So essentially, federal income tax, the way we've designed it here in the US, is an automatic stabilizer. It does help stabilize incomes and spending in an economy to some extent. The other one I was going to put there is those transfer payments. Now, again, the reason that they're making different exceptions for unemployment unemployment insurance than they've ever made before is they're trying to keep spending in the economy up. People don't have income, they don't spend it. People who are on unemployment are typically just trying to cover their necessary expenses. They're not getting rich off unemployment. And that keeps spending in the economy better than if everybody who lost their jobs just didn't have any money and didn't do any spending. So it's actually a favor that the government is doing to the economy when they issue unemployment, because it helps keep that spending and that multiplication effect that we've already talked about, that simple spending multiplier. It keeps that whole thing going, which is a good thing. Now, on the flip side of that, when times are good, unemployment checks go down. The number of people receiving unemployment is going to go down. And that's a good thing. We don't want to give people money if they already have it and they're already spending it anyway. So, actually, you know what? I'm going to let you guys unmute yourselves if you want to. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Everybody's good? Okay, so let's go on to the second type of fiscal policy tools. This is Obama, this is Trump. This is what's going on right now, is what we call discretionary fiscal policy. It's discretionary because it's at the discretion of the government that's in place at that time. And so it's a decision they get to make. It's stimulus type programs. These are sort of one-time things. These aren't something that's built into the economy like the automatic stabilizers. So discretionary fiscal policy is a government decision to manipulate purchases, transfer payments, and taxes to promote economic goals. So these come in two basic forms. A lot of times we see them both happen at one time. These can be stimulus programs. These are programs to stimulate an economy. So spending that will then create that ripple effect. One-time tax rebates, that's kind of what we're seeing when Trump talks about sending checks to everybody. I think the intent is for it to be something like a one-time tax rebate, and hopefully that will increase spending. We'll talk about, when we talk about what happened when Obama tried to do this, we'll talk about how this doesn't always work, which is my concern about the $2 trillion proposed fiscal policy, is that in times like this, it doesn't always work the way we hope it does, or the way we really need it to. And so this discretionary fiscal policy is usually a package, a stimulus program with some sort of tax changes or tax rebates or things like that. All right, so this is going to look really similar to something that we did. It's been a couple weeks ago for sure. Well, 2 or 3 weeks ago, where we talked about what would happen if we saw an increase in investment spending, and how this is when we first talked about the simple spending multiplier and how we could use this as a tool, right? And so ironically, this example that you are going to see here today is exactly what is being proposed by Trump and the Trump administration and the Senate, to be honest. So if the government believes unemployment is too high, which right now unemployment is too high, the government can use fiscal policy and government spending, increasing government purchases, to shift aggregate expenditure. Remember, the aggregate expenditure line is that, you'll see it here in a minute, it's on a slide, is that line that's the consumption function plus the investment function plus the government spending function plus the net export function. And we use that 45-degree tool to sort of figure out where that economy would be in terms of GDP demanded. Any one of those things, C plus I plus G plus net exports, are you guys Are you guys seeing my new PowerPoints? Like, as I flip through, I have a couple people saying they're not seeing it.
No.
You're not seeing the new slides come up?
It's still stuck on the title one.
It only shows the first one.
Ah, okay.
Is your screen frozen?
No, like I'm flipping right through.
Do we have to click enable editing?
I just have it open through the send gauge. That's what I've been doing.
Oh, shoot, guys. I'm sorry. Let me see.
Right now, we can't click that.
Let me see if I can do this a different way. Sorry about that. Do you see that?
The screen just changed.
Do you see? Now can you see me flipping through or no?
Yeah.
It's
Okay,
better.
sorry about that. I guess I have to do it on this. I don't know. Guess I can't do it full screen. I apologize for that. All right, so, okay, so here's where we are. Changes in government purchases. If the government believes unemployment is too high, they'll increase government purchases, shifting aggregate expenditure, moving it up, if you will. Production to meet that increased demand from the government and the government spending, like government spending is going to go up, and firms and people need to meet the demand of that new government spending. So as a result of that, just that government spending alone is going to increase the production of whatever it is the government is spending their money on, and it actually doesn't matter what it is. Okay, this increased production then leads to increased income for the people doing the production and the firms doing the production. So that increased income that's now being distributed to the people doing the producing then becomes money for those people to spend. And that's how that simple spending multiplier is going to be really, really important when we talk about fiscal policy and when we talk about the government injecting new monies into the economy in order to try and force or coax those series of spending rounds to begin, and therefore that production increases jobs, which decreases unemployment. So that's the intent, that's the theory. Again, doesn't always work out the way we hope. Okay, so here you can see the graph. You've actually seen almost this exact same graph before, except for up at the top where it says a $0.1 trillion increase in government purchases. It said a $0.1 trillion increase in investment. So I don't know if you remember that when we first talked about the simple spending multiplier, but we're back there again because it actually doesn't matter if it's an increase in investment, an increase in consumption, an increase in government spending. Any of those things is going to increase aggregate expenditure and shift that line up because of all of those rounds of spending. We're going to see really many times as much spending compared to that initial injection of money by the government, initial injection of investment, or initial injection of consumer spending, which we'll get to consumer spending here in a minute, but and how that's part of fiscal policy as well. So what you can see here is that AE line, the dark blue line, shifted up to the light blue line by $0.1 trillion. And when that happened, right, and we see where the new line intersects the 45-degree tool there at point B, we can see that that $0.1 trillion increase in government purchases through fiscal policy has actually created a much larger gain in GDP demanded. In fact, it's $0.5 trillion. You can see as we went from the 14 trillion there at point A to the 14.5 trillion there at point B. Any questions on that? Good? Okay. All right, so we're going to go back to the simple spending multiplier. We've done this before, but spending is spending is spending. It doesn't matter who's doing it, it's injecting money into the economy, okay? So whether it's C plus I plus G, doesn't matter, any one of those can actually create that injection of new money into the economy. Simple spending multiplier. So first thing you see there, 1 divided by MPS, that's your multiplier. That's how we calculate the multiplier. In this particular economy, we're going to say we have an MPC of 0.8. I think this is almost the exact same example that I used when I first taught you simple spending multiplier, okay? Which means the MPS, the marginal propensity to save, or what percentage of the money gets saved, is going to be 20% or 0.2. So you can see there on the third line, we have calculated the MPS. We've actually done the calculation. 1 divided by 0.2 equals 5. 5's then your multiplier. Once you get a multiplier, you got to multiply it. Okay, this is going to be important for your exam next Thursday. Okay, understanding how to come up with the simple spending multipliers and then how to do the multiplication and figure out what's going to happen as a result. So we took the multiplier of 5 times the 0.1, which was the change in government purchases. That's going to give us that 0.5. So then we have a $0.5 trillion increase in GDP. So $0.1 trillion worth of government injection for government purchases through fiscal policy. And what we get out is 5 times as much spending based on that MPC. Okay. All right. So when we go back, I think we're, oh no. Okay. So when we go, when we go back, this is the graph we just looked at. You can see that that 0.5 trillion is the difference between the 14 and the 14.5. So it's just a way of not having to do the graph, is we just do the simple spending multiplier instead. Okay. Here's where I'm going to throw a monkey wrench into the whole simple spending multiplier thing. Is there are a couple of different big fiscal policy tools. First one is changes in government spending. It's easy for the government to increase their spending or decrease their spending. They can, as soon as they get it through, Congress, and as soon as they get spending approved, it's pretty easy for the government to spend. The government has plenty of things they can randomly spend money on. The other thing the government can do, and this is really popular when it comes to fiscal policy, discretionary fiscal policy, is they can change people's taxes. They can give people tax cuts. They can send people checks, okay? So when the government reduces taxes or even sends people checks, it's a little bit of a different ball game than when the government does this spending themselves, because you and I don't act like the government all the time. Just because the government sends me a check for $2,000 doesn't mean I'm going to go spend $2,000. That's the risk of giving money to the American people and saying, hey, here's a gift from the government to stimulate the economy. If you don't spend it, it's a bust, right? And so this makes me a little leery about the proposed plan. I haven't read through it word by word, which I'm going to before I really form an opinion. But we've learned this from the past, and it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican. We've learned in the past that the American people in hard economic times can sometimes go from spending 98% of their income to spending very little of it if they don't have to. So that's the risk here. So let's go through this. There's something called a simple tax multiplier, because this is a totally different scenario, okay? So change in net taxes. To stimulate aggregate demand, the government can reduce your taxes. They can also give you money, right? It's kind of the same thing. They're putting the spending in your hands, okay? So if the government proposes a tax cut, this increases the disposable income for households. Households hopefully increase their spending with that additional disposable income they didn't have to pay in taxes, or that additional disposable income that's sent to them in the form of a check. And that series of spending would begin again, in that spending becomes income for somebody, which becomes spending for that person, which becomes income for somebody else, and spending for that person, so on and so forth, and creates that rippling effect. And hopefully, aggregate demand will increase. All demand for everything will hopefully increase. And when you increase demand for everything, just like the government did with their own spending, you put people back to work trying to meet that demand, trying to produce those things that everybody wants, okay? Okay, so right here, and actually, when I was going through this, I think I saw that this graph, one of the numbers on this graph is wrong. That 14.5 should actually be 14.4, and I'll make that correction on Cengage. I'll see if I can't put a little patch over that to make it 14.4 instead of 14.5, and you'll see that here in a minute. But here we're talking about sort of the same economy that here at point A had $14 trillion worth of spending. And then we're talking about decreasing people's taxes, allowing for hopefully increased rounds of spending. In this case, we're talking about the effect of $0.1 trillion decrease in net taxes. Here's the thing, is you and I probably aren't going to spend every penny that they give us because we have a choice to save or to spend, okay? Our marginal propensity to consume in this economy is still the same. It's going to be 0.8, okay? Which means 20% of that $0.1 trillion decrease in net taxes isn't going to get spent because that represents what we saved. So do you see that 0.08 increase there? That's consumption going up. That's the C part, because decreasing taxes doesn't do anything to government spending. What it does is it increases your consumption, the C part of this, okay? Now, keep in your mind that that 14.5 is wrong and it should be 14.4, and I'm going to show you a new calculation that we call the simple tax multiplier. Okay, this is new to you. You got to know this, okay? The negatives are very important. They're not important when we talk about simple spending multiplier. We don't care about negatives because we're taking sort of absolute values. It doesn't matter. But for the simple tax multiplier, you got to keep all these negatives straight, okay? So the actual equation is negative MPC divided by MPS. So negative marginal propensity to consume divided by marginal propensity to save. Both of your multiplier equations have MPS in the denominator. So that's one way for you to help you keep this straight, okay? But since you are taking an online exam, right, this would be something that I would have available during the exam, is these equations, so you don't screw this up, okay? If your MPC is 0.8, which we already determined it was, that would give you a negative 0.8 divided by 0.2. So your multiplier is a negative in this case, and it's a -4. So if we take that -4 and we multiply it by a decrease in taxes, here's where you want to add a negative so that it doesn't screw you up. You want to use a negative or positive to talk about how the taxes are changing. In this case, taxes are going down. So it's a -0.1 is the change in net taxes, okay? And then when you multiply those two together, it gives you a 0.4, which means you got a $4.4 trillion increase in GDP. That's why that previous graph should have said 14.4 and not 14.5. It should be clear, right, that when the government did the spending on our previous SSM example, we got a $0.5 trillion increase in GDP demanded. When we give the money to the people by either decreasing their taxes or could happen by sending them a check, we're taking the risk that these people are going to save money. And sometimes even more money than they usually do. In these cases, we're actually assuming that people's savings stayed the same as they usually are. So for this economy, that's that 20%. So if we can predict how much money people are going to save, we can use this calculation and come up with a pretty good idea. Problem is people are unpredictable and they don't always do what we want them to do, what we need them to do, or what we predict they will do. But you can see it is more effective for the government to do its own spending than to give the money to people to do the spending. We get more multiplication if the government just injects it and injects every penny of it. Why would the government choose to send you a check as being proposed to send you thousands of dollars, right? Why are they going to do that instead of do the spending themselves? Does anybody have any thoughts?
Political purposes.
Thank you. Okay, this is about gaining, voters. This is about creating a system where people are looking at a particular president or a particular party and saying, this is what they've done for me. The fact is, they borrowed it all. We've borrowed it all from ourselves. You're going to have to pay it back one day, just like I'm going to have to in that national debt mess we have, right? So yeah, you get the money now, you still owe it later, and you owe it plus interest. And at some point, we're going to have to deal with that. But it's highly political. If the government spends all the money themselves and never sends any to you and I, we're going to be really pissed about that. But we like the idea of these checks coming in the mail. So thank you. Okay, let's get back to those gaps, right? We've been talking about these gaps, these recessionary gaps and expansionary gaps. There is nothing, more relevant than what we're about to talk about right now, and it's using discretionary fiscal policy to close a recessionary gap. We have a recessionary gap that is widening literally by the day, okay? So if the economy is producing less than its potential output, let's remind you what potential output is. Potential output is that nice, normal, sustainable level of production that every single economy has. So if we are producing less than potential output, we have a recessionary gap. We currently, and it really just happened in a matter of weeks, have a fairly significant recessionary gap. The government has a choice here when they decide to implement discretionary fiscal policy, right? They have made some changes to our automatic stabilizers, like increasing unemployment benefits, not making it, they've cut a lot of red tape for people. They're not requiring that people look for jobs right away because they know there aren't really any jobs to look for. So they've changed that automatic stabilizer program too. But the discretionary fiscal policy is going to be the big one, okay? Is going to be the big one. And they have a choice. They can increase government purchases in the case of a recessionary gap. They can cut taxes, or chances are they're going to do both. We're going to see both. It's usually a package deal. They usually don't do one without the other for political reasons. Like the government spending is really best for the economy in terms of the multiplication effect, but the tax cuts, the checks, whatever, those are going to be more popular in terms of politics and voting, and we're coming up on an election, right? So the government can increase purchases or cut taxes in order to return the economy to its potential output. We call this expansionary fiscal policy. It's going to expand the economy. It's going to expand production, hopefully expand demand, and get us out of that recessionary gap, close, if you will, the recessionary gap. So if you look here, right, and this is what's happening right now. We expected demand in this country to be at a certain level. In the beginning of the year, it was at a certain level. demand has changed. Demand for everything has changed. And so we have ended up with demand that was much lower than we expected it to be. Again, just happened, right? And because of that, demand, where demand and supply intersect, which is going to be at point E, that's like where we're at right now. We're like at point E right now. We have a recessionary gap. We thought we were going to be producing at potential output, and we're not. Okay, so we have a recessionary gap in this case of $0.5 trillion. The economy does do some self-correcting. And remember, when the economy self-corrects, we talked about this during the aggregate supply chapter, which I think was our last chapter. We talked about how the supply curve could shift to close that gap. When the economy can't do it itself, it takes time. It takes time for the economy to self-correct. Sometimes it takes so long that you end up in something like a Great Depression. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes too. When you have a recessionary gap and the government and the people are not willing to wait out that natural recovery, the economy can be forced back to potential output, or forced back closer to potential output. And so that's what's happening here. As you can see, the aggregate demand curve, the dark blue one, the one that intersects there at point E, if what is happening right now with this discretionary fiscal policy, they haven't actually come up with a solid plan yet. It's still going through lots and lots of levels of bureaucracy. That could shift, hopefully, the aggregate demand curve to the right, to that light blue aggregate demand curve, right, with the asterisks, AD asterisks. And you can see then we have closed the recessionary gap if we can make that happen. You can see that we see inflation. Inflation's not a terrible thing. Inflation, a little bit of inflation is actually better than deflation. To be honest, we're going to start seeing deflation here pretty quick. Is that discretionary fiscal policy can help close that gap. Any questions on that? Everybody good? Okay. So, sorry, I'm new to this Zoom thing and I don't always know where I'm going to look for stuff. Okay. So discretionary fiscal policy to close an expansionary gap. So this would be the exact opposite. This is what you would want to do if the economy was overheating, which it does. It does overheat. And we actually probably in the last few years have seen some slight overheating. The government's watching it. The Federal Reserve Bank is watching it. And they're slowly making the opposite decisions in order to close any expansionary gap or any overheating of the economy. So it would just be the opposite. If the economy is producing more than its potential output, the government can decrease purchases or increase taxes in order to return the economy to its potential output. This happens in small doses, where I feel like discretionary fiscal policy to close a recessionary gap happens in huge doses. It's usually sort of a panic approach, but this is usually done. Economies don't overheat as fast as they can recess, okay? So the government, again, has those two choices or combination of the two, the purchases and the taxes. We call this contractionary fiscal policy. It contracts the economy, sort of brings it back. Its objective is really to decrease demand. How do you decrease demand? Take away people's money or take away government money. And it has that same multiplication effect, but it has that multiplication effect coming out of the economy instead of injecting it. So here's that example of that discretionary fiscal policy closing an expansionary gap. So if we've expanded there at like the E with the little, sorry, it's been a long couple weeks. They're at the 14.5, right? The demand hopefully would decrease because of increases in taxes or decreases in government spending, or a combination of the two, and get us back to potential output. There we see deflation. Again, we don't see that happen in huge doses, that contractionary fiscal policy. Okay. All right, so that's sort of it for the graphs and the calculations. Let's talk a little bit about how fiscal policy has changed. Fiscal policy really started in the Great Depression. I've actually been taking my spare time to watch a lot of interesting videos on the Great Depression. I don't want to freak anybody out, but I think we have, I think the recession's going to be a big one, and I think there are lessons we can learn from times like that. So I've been trying to catch up on my history of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was actually the first time in history that fiscal policy was used. Prior to the Great Depression, we practiced something called classical economic theory, which is basically the theory that if you leave an economy alone, it'll be fine, and that you shouldn't touch it, you shouldn't mess with it, which I think for the most part holds true. And in many cases, I wish the government wouldn't intervene as much. But what we saw during that time is that the self-correcting was happening very, very slowly, and that the Great Depression got so bad that it was really hard to pull out of. And so it was really during the Great Depression that the government decided they needed to come up with something, some government policies that could help an economy in the case of something like this. They figured it wasn't working, and actually the Employment Act of 1946 was really one of the first discretionary fiscal policies that we saw. We saw bits of it right after the Great Depression, but this was the first real big move towards discretionary fiscal policy to get us out of the Great Depression. But also World War II being right at the end of the Great Depression actually is what I would say helped us get out of the Great Depression more than anything else. I mean, that is just huge injection of government spending, but that's fiscal policy, right? Automatic stabilizers, we've already talked about this. This just gives you a little bit more detail. The intent of an automatic stabilizer, look at that statement there at the very bottom. Stabilizers reduce the magnitude of GDP fluctuations. GDP fluctuations are hard on an economy, whether it's up or down. And that progressive taxation system that I told you exists is a big part of that. And unemployment insurance, welfare checks, things like that. Obviously, those payments are going to go up during recessions, but they're going to go way down when the times are good. And so they just help stabilize spending in an economy. That's all. It's more about spending. To be honest with you, from an economic perspective, it's more about the actual spending than the humanitarian deed of the checks themselves. It's necessary to inject money into an economy at times like this. And if you give it to people who don't have any other incomes, chances are they're going to spend a lot of it, a huge portion of it, okay? Legs in fiscal policy, the biggest problem with fiscal policy, the biggest problem. It has a lot of problems, right? But one of the biggest problems is its policy that has a lot of bureaucracy and red tape and politicians attached to it. This fiscal policy, it takes a long, long time to actually get it done and get the money distributed, just because there's too many people involved, right? Time is required. So we're all patiently waiting to see what happens, right? It just takes time. And then even once it's approved by the powers that be, I mean, how long does it take the government to round up that money and actually get it to where it needs to be? It takes a really long time, okay? Many times policies happen actually when it's too late. Like by the time we work it through all the political parties and all the, you know, banter and whatever, a lot of times we don't get it when we need it. We get it weeks later, months later, hopefully not years later, right? And sometimes it actually can do more harm, because by that time we're in a totally different position, good or bad, and we need different policy. We need different fiscal Discretionary fiscal policy doesn't leave a lot of room for error, yet it causes a lot of error. If you're trying to get us back to potential output, that's a very specific place. And fiscal policy, if it's not enacted at the right time in the right way, can actually overcorrect an economy or can do very little to correct an economy. So hopefully they have a lot of economists working on this particular policy so that it does what we want it to do. Let's talk about the last recession. When I teach this next year, obviously I'm going to have something about today, but right now we don't know how this is all going to turn out. But the last big discretionary fiscal policy is going to be for the 2007-2009 recession. In early 2008, right, we had a Republican in office. Then we're going to see that Obama came into office. This is not a partisan thing. Doesn't matter who was president. We probably would have seen a lot of the same things happen. And if there was a Democrat in office today, we would see something happen. This is about being a responsive president and, trying to preserve the popularity that you have or whatever. It doesn't matter who you are, okay? So in early 2008, we saw Bush tax cuts. When we talk in the next chapter, we'll talk about our national debt. And you're going to see how a lot of these fiscal policies have really added huge amounts to our national debt. Because you just can't, the government just can't pull money out of thin air, right? And they're not going to print it because that creates inflation. So they borrow it. So we saw some Bush tax cuts because the Bush administration did see that the economy was softening and thought that if they did a little something, they really didn't understand why, but if they saw a little something that maybe they could close what was perceived to be a pretty small recessionary gap at the time. By late 2008, we had a full-on financial crisis. And it wasn't something that could really be fixed with tax cuts. It was problems with our mortgage system, the way that we distributed housing loans and things like that. It had nothing to do with tax cuts. So Obama proposed a stimulus package, just like Trump is proposing now. And I think this is our last slide, and then we're gonna go through those two videos real quick. Obama signed a $787 billion package. Now we're talking about $2 trillion, okay? So 2.5 times that, something like that. It was a pretty, it really wasn't a package that distributed money to households. It did in some different ways. It did provide some tax cuts for lower income individuals, created things like loans and schooling grants for people to go back to school while they were unemployed. Like it spent the money in probably pretty specific ways. It was all deficit spending, which means we borrowed all of it. Does anybody know, we borrow about half of our money domestically from domestic producers, investors and companies, so individuals, companies. And then the other half of the money we get really from international governments who loan us money. Does anybody know who our biggest lender is? What country loans us more money than any other?
Is it China?
It's China. Whoa, that's ironic, right? So we have ourselves a situation where we're in a position where we need to borrow money, and China's one of our biggest lenders. I don't know how this is all going to go down, right? That will remain to be seen. But you can see the Obama stimulus package was a huge amount of debt too, right? This actually ended up being more like $850 billion by the time it was done. It ended up being higher than we thought. But you can see that the deficit spending is equal to $7,500 per household. It means per household in the United States, our national debt went up $7,500 per household. So what do you think is going to happen with $2 trillion, right? Is each household actually going to get enough to offset all that deficit and interest that we're going to pay on that. I mean, this is tricky, right? It's not all, this isn't all rainbows, right? These checks coming from the government, there are strings attached, there are costs to everything, remember that, okay? The effect of stimulus money, depends on the spending multiplier. So you have to gauge what your people are going to do. Are your people going to spend, or are they not going to spend? And you got to know that before you give them their money. Because if you give them their money and they don't do what they're supposed to do with it, all you did was give away money and accumulate debt, right? All right, so I want to run you through the Obama stimulus package and the simple spending multiplier. I think you might find this mildly interesting. Let me see. Sorry. Where? Sorry, people. Can't find my cursor. My God. Okay. I don't think I'm. Okay, I'm going to bring up this whiteboard. Tell me if you can you guys see this whiteboard?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So if we go back to the last recession, Americans usually have a marginal propensity to save of about 2% or 0.02. The problem is we were so deep into the recession by the time this fiscal policy actually got to us or started to make an impact for us, which I suspect is going to happen again. It's just hard to get that money moving sometimes. That by the time the money came to us, our marginal propensity to consume, you should take a few notes right now about what I say, right? The reason the Obama stimulus package really didn't have the impact that we thought it was going to have or that we needed it to have is because our marginal propensity to save went from 0.02 to 0.7. So we went from saving 2% of our money to saving 70% of our money. So when we think about that in terms of what the simple spending multiplier would be for that money, remember that simple spending multiplier is 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save, which in this case ended up being 0.7. If you do that math, your multiplier for that Obama stimulus money is a 1.4. So we got a multiplication of a 1.4. That is not a multiplication, right? That's almost, we got exactly the spending that the government, right? We just, there was no multiplication at all, right? The money was essentially lost in the economy. That 0.4, many economists say that we've paid so much interest on that money that 0.4 doesn't even come close to like covering the interest that we've had to pay on the money for the Obama stimulus package. What was Obama going to do? Obama was going to do exactly what he did. And any president sitting there was going to do exactly the same thing. And any president current day was going to do something. It's really hard, though, in times like this to get people to do what they need to do to heal the economy. Okay. Any questions about the lecture? We're going to watch some videos and talk briefly about them afterwards.
Aren't people technically spending a lot more on like quarantine supplies and like stocking up? So
I think the people with money are. I think the people with money put a quick surge of dollars into the economy. But if you think about it, we're just demanding different things. Like people are buying whatever, hand sanitizer, you know, rice, whatever. But what we're not demanding, if you think about it, is haircuts and meals out and drinks at the bar and gasoline. So demand for some things is going up, but I would say demand for other things is way down. That's a great question though. But what we're going to see is things are going to level off in terms of spending because people who have a stockpile have their stockpile, and people who don't aren't just simply not going to have that much money to spend and aren't going to be able to buy those huge amounts of goods. Yeah, it's a great question. Anything else? Okay, so let's give me just a sec. Do you guys see the Donald Trump video?
Yeah.
Yeah? Sorry, I didn't hear you. Was that a yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna play that for you guys real quick. I pulled up the Obama one someplace, I'll have to find it, but I'm gonna play this one. It's just like 3 minutes, okay? Take a couple notes, just a couple, for exam purposes.
I don't hear any sound.
Okay, so I guess you guys aren't getting any sound on the video. Is that right? Hang on. Okay, sorry, people. I'm just gonna put the link someplace to the 2 videos. I'll put them on BB Learn, and you can watch them then. Okay, so I'll put a link somewhere that says, hang on,
Even the title would be helpful.
what's that?
Even just the title, we can YouTube search it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll make sure I put that up on BB Learn. You'll see it. I'll put it up right after we convene here. Okay. Sorry about that. I'll see if I can't figure some of this stuff out before the next class. So this is where I'm gonna stop recording.